States Air Force Strategic Air Command, SAC for most people. It's the Navy's long-range advanced strike force with intercontinental bombers and ballistic missiles. SAC's mission, to be ready, round the clock to respond decisively to the orders of the National Command Authorities in relation to any strategic threat and the vital interests of the United States. To maintain a ready, flexible stand, SAC regularly conducts command post and field training exercises, which test the ability of SAC forces to execute their emergency war orders. Normally, such an exercise begins here in the headquarters SAC underground command post, with a simulated change in the worldwide alert condition. A coded message reflecting increased world tension comes in from the Joint Chiefs of Staff through the National Military Command Center in Washington, D.C. The headquarters SAC Command Post Emergency Action Team receives the message and retransmits it to all subordinate units. At the same time, the senior controller initiates a pyramid alert recall of the SAC headquarters battle staff and key military personnel. With the increase in the worldwide alert condition, SAC places additional forces on alert. Subordinate units receive the message directing a general increase in unit readiness. Transmission. The emergency action message triggers the recall of battle staff and key military personnel at the numbered air forces and at all operational units. Personnel are recalled and the battle staff formed. The SAC commander and his staff monitor the generation of aircraft and missile forces. To manage these forces, SAC employs strict command control procedures to maintain contact with and control of combat crews and their weapon systems. Alternate battle staff at the missile bases deployed to wing alternate command posts near the missile field, where they would continue operations if the main operating bases are destroyed. SAC's day-to-day alert force remains on alert and ready to respond to real-world situations. Under the increased alert conditions, additional SAC bombers and tanker forces are generated and placed on alert with the day-to-day force. Generation of bombers and tankers means preparing them for their wartime missions, maintenance, fuel, ordnance, check. Bomber and tanker crews are briefed on mission profiles, tactics, communication, targeting, and safe passage procedures. A majority of the SAC missile force is on constant alert. Missiles in a training configuration and those down for maintenance are quickly generated to an alert status. To prevent infiltration and sabotage, SAC security police are specially trained to contain any situation that might threaten weapon systems on the ground. The increased alert condition calls for many decisions on the part of the SAC commander and his battle staff.
Sir, based on the current situation, I recommend that we disperse forces to ready, standby, and civilian bases. Do you concur?
Comment from the staff. I agree, sir. All right. Recommendation approved. Thank you, sir. Based upon the briefing, the SAC commander elects to disperse a portion of the generated force to other military and civilian bases. The additional dispersal bases increase the targeting problems for the enemy and provide more runway to launch aircraft in a shorter period of time. This enhances their survivability by getting them airborne faster to avoid being caught on the ground by enemy missiles. In support of these aircraft, teams of operations, maintenance, security, and communications personnel are transported to the dispersal bases. As simulated tensions again increase, the National Command Authorities declare a further increase in the worldwide alert condition. In response, the SAC commander orders full generation of all remaining SAC bomber and tanker forces. The Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve Tanker Force represents 1/5 of SAC's refueling support. SAC to respond with the same precision as active SAC PC-135 units. Their timely generation is crucial to the effective employment of the SAC bomber. Once the remaining force has been generated, some of those sorties are also deployed to SAC and non-SAC dispersal bases. With any significant increase in emergency war operations, additional personnel are needed to augment combat support forces. To meet this need, SAC's War Skill program trains people who are in non-combat positions to function in other specialties, for which there would be an urgent need during the first stages of conflict. The program involves training and use of these personnel to supplement critical skills such as pavement maintenance, construction, law enforcement, and medical service and administration. During the exercise, disaster control teams are prepared to manage aircraft crashes, fires, large fuel spills, and other accidents. To assist in the exercise realism, communications personnel jam intra-base radio frequencies and telecommunications systems. This provides base personnel with the opportunity to practice overcoming the electronic interference they would encounter in a combat environment. Others monitor intra-base radio and telephone networks to evaluate communication security. As simulated enemy provocation increases, the Joint Chiefs direct an airborne alert as a show of force to demonstrate resolve. In response to the directive, the SAC commander orders selected bombers and tankers to fly airborne alerts. The emergency action team directs the field units to implement airborne alerts.
Based on your previous decision to implement and execute the joint launch mission, those forces are launching and will proceed to the orbit areas indicated on screen 3.
Over the next several hours, the crews are briefed, the mission reviewed, and the aircraft launched. In anticipation of further hostilities, various support teams are dispatched to forward operating locations and remote U.S. areas. The purpose is to enable SAC to continue operations and to recover its forces in the event a strategic nuclear attack destroys its main operating bases. A headquarters emergency relocation team, representing key officers in SAC headquarters, deploys to a remote location where it will carry on if the headquarters were destroyed. Bomber control, bomber mobile recovery, and tanker recovery teams move to their off-base hold points for survivability and await the orders to proceed to their pickup airfield. These teams consist primarily of maintenance personnel, whose job it is to perform essential maintenance on post-strike bombers and tankers at forward operating locations, preparing these aircraft for return to surviving bases. As the threat increases, the order is issued to launch the post-attack command control aircraft. These aircraft will augment the SAC airborne command post, which flies constant airborne alerts round the clock. Purpose? To back up the SAC underground command post and battle staff should it be destroyed. Headquarters to an all-out enemy attack appears imminent. Pending the president's decision to counterattack, the SAC commander makes the decision to launch the SAC aircraft under positive control.
General, we have indications that one of the Washington launches doesn't work well. This activity is now displayed on the document monitors behind you. This rollout assessment of decision timing is also done. The eventual decision on policy control options is the third supervisor.
For your decision timing,
Once the force from your positive control, I'm going airborne. Yes, sir.
The units accomplish selected checklist actions to improve reaction time in anticipation of a presidential order to execute. Bombers and tankers remain in their orbits awaiting the order to strike or return. With the decision to launch SAC aircraft under positive control, the SAC commander has assured the survival of the bomber-tanker force. Now airborne, he is in direct communication with his tactical units and crews, and with the National Command Authority. Support teams, previously deployed to off-base hold points for survival, arrive at their pickup airfield, where they will be airlifted to forward operating locations. Bomber control teams will act as forward command posts, directing the recovery of aircraft after the strike. Bomber mobile recovery teams will deploy with the control teams to recover post-strike aircraft at the forward operating location. Tanker recovery teams will prepare PC-135 aircraft for their return to post-strike bases. The simulated enemy strike is confirmed. A mass missile raid on the U.S. is in progress. The order comes in from the president. Execute the retaliatory attack. Following the counterattack, reconnaissance aircraft head for target areas to assess the damage. The staff commander continues to monitor his forces, those executed, and those that will be needed for follow-up strikes. The primary bomber force has truckled planes and simulates returning to the United States. The post-attack command control battle staff directs returning aircraft to surviving main operating bases or to alternate reconstitution locations. At the surviving alternate locations, maintenance teams are in place and waiting to recover the bombers and tankers for a second strike or continued alert as required. The message comes in from the National Command Authority. Hostilities have been terminated. Initiate recall procedures. To ensure that all tactical elements receive the message, the Airborne Command Post uses every surviving communication system at its disposal to contact the scattered force.
I got a message.
This includes the Emergency Rocket Communication System, a Minuteman missile with a communications package in place of its warhead.
Okay, I've got
The missile is then launched by the Airborne Launch Control Center. With the launch of the rocket communication system and return of all aircraft, global shield came to an end.
On September 7, 1979, the President of the United States announced his selection of the basing mode for the MX missile, a new survivable ICBM. 3 months earlier, he had approved development of the MX missile. With these two decisions, both the missile and the basing mode entered a 5-year full-scale engineering development program.
system is survivable, it's verifiable, it has a minimum impact on the environment, it's affordable in cost, and it's consistent with our SALT goal of deep reduction in strategic arms.
The following discussion defines the Soviet threats to our strategic forces that led to these decisions and explains how the MX system will enhance ICBM survivability and retain the unique characteristics which ICBMs contribute to our strategic deterrent. For 20 years, the strategic deterrent power of the United States has rested on a three-pronged arsenal of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and our heavy bomber force, commonly called the Triad. Throughout the lifetime of this strategic deterrent power, the Department of Defense has modernized the three elements to maintain their credibility. We have thus continually overcome the Soviets' attempt to thwart the effectiveness of this triad. For example, the range of our submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, has been increased from the 1,500-mile Polaris to the 2,500-mile Poseidon, and now to the 4,000 nautical mile Trident I, currently being deployed in the fleet. Thus, the Trident missiles can be launched at a greater distance from the target, so that the Trident has 10 times as much ocean area which to hide from Soviet detection. Similarly, when the Soviets perfected their high-altitude interception techniques against our B-52 bombers, our tactics were changed to low-level penetration of Soviet defenses. With new techniques and equipment, our bombers could penetrate under the Soviet radars and anti-aircraft missiles. When the Soviets developed look-down and shoot-down interception techniques, we developed and tested the cruise missile. Our B-52s will present the Soviet Union a mixed force of bombers and terrain-hugging cruise missiles. This mixed force would require the Soviet deployment of thousands of defensive systems instead of just hundreds. The third leg of our strategic nuclear triad is our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. Since the early 1960s, our Titan II and Minuteman ICBMs, buried in hardened vertical silos, have been the cornerstone of the triad. Their alert rate is high. They can be launched almost instantaneously and under positive command and control procedures. ICBMs are also highly reliable, reducing maintenance and operating costs. Most importantly, maintaining this ICBM force ensures that the Soviets cannot concentrate solely on defeating the other two legs of the triad. Today, this ICBM force consists of 54 Titan II missiles, a single-warhead heavyweight ICBM, 450 Minuteman II single-warhead ICBMs, and 550 Minuteman III, a multiple, independently targeted reentry vehicle system with 3 warheads. Both the Titan and Minuteman weapons have been modernized and hardened. However, despite these efforts, our ICBMs located in fixed silos are becoming vulnerable to the increasing accuracy and numbers of Soviet missiles. This is the most serious problem facing our strategic forces today. Our intelligence capabilities and verification techniques have determined that the newest Soviet ICBMs, which they are now deploying, have a guidance accuracy and warhead yield combination that seriously threatens the survivability of our current ICBM force. By the early to mid-1980s, the Soviet Union will have deployed enough warheads to destroy 90% of our ICBM force with a preemptive first strike. During this critical period, our missile-carrying submarines at sea are expected to remain undetectable and ride out a first strike and be available for a retaliatory launch. Future Soviet anti-submarine detection capabilities are unknown. Therefore, we cannot simply assume that our SLBM force will remain undetectable forever. Our alert force of B-52s, given adequate warning, can be launched and escape destruction. However, a Soviet SLBM barrage attack might overcome this force on the ground. Additionally, while we have the capability to launch our ICBMs under attack, this option, a hair-trigger situation, does not provide crisis stability. This tactic requires highly accurate and reliable assessment of the attack against us, and assumes that our warning systems have not been destroyed. We would therefore prefer not to depend on launch under attack, although it is an option we will maintain. Thus, it is imperative we maintain a survivable ICBM force to ensure that if any other triad components become vulnerable in the future, overall strategic deterrence will not be seriously eroded while we correct the problem. Development of the MX missile with its survivable basing mode will reduce ICBM vulnerability and maintain a strong, credible triad. The MX has been under advanced development for several years. A three-stage missile, MX will be 70 feet long, 92 inches in diameter, and weigh about 190,000 pounds. MX is the largest new missile permitted under the SALT II agreement, and its 10 warheads and 7,940-pound payload are the maximum allowed under that treaty. The first stage motor will contain a high-energy solid propellant already tested in static firing, along with the new steerable single nozzle concept. The second stage will use a new high-energy solid propellant with another new development, an extendable nozzle exit cone. This nozzle extends at altitude, allowing greater expansion of the exhaust gases, thus increasing performance. The third stage motor also will use an extendable nozzle and a new solid propellant of even higher energy than the lower stages. A liquid propellant fourth stage will provide the maneuvering ability and precision to dispense the 10 warheads to individual targets. The guidance system, based on the advanced inertial reference sphere concept, has been developed and tested. This system, along with the new computer, will provide MX the flexibility necessary for a ground mobile system. The re-entry system will house warheads of the same or better quality than the re-entry vehicles previously developed for Minuteman III. The first flight test of the MX missile is scheduled for 1983 from Vandenberg Air Force Base, California, with the first 10 missiles operational in mid-1986. The MX basing mode is a multiple protective shelter system. The planned cluster deployment areas are located in the southwestern United States. This photograph of a typical valley has been retouched to simulate the locations of shelters and roads. The following animation of the basing mode is not drawn to scale, and the shelters and roads have been intentionally enlarged to clearly depict the operation of the system. A cluster road will connect 23 horizontal shelters, which support a single MX missile. A specially designed transporter will move the missile in its launcher on unpaved roads between shelters. A 2.5-acre area around each shelter, roughly the same size as currently surrounding each Minuteman silo, will be fenced for security reasons. All other areas will continue to be open to the public. The MX system is currently planned for 200 missiles and 4,600 shelters. The MX shelters and support areas will require about 25 square nautical miles of land to be removed from public use. Other activities, such as mining and ranching, will be permitted in the areas between the shelters. Private aircraft will be permitted to fly over them in accordance with FAA flight rules. Each of the valleys that appears usable based on geological considerations will accommodate several clusters. Adjacent complexes will be interconnected by service roads unable to support the weight of the transporter. Thus, a single MX missile will be constantly associated with a cluster of 23 protective shelters. Several factors contribute to the survivability of the system. Each shelter will be about a mile from any other, so that one enemy warhead could not eliminate more than one shelter. The transporter vehicles carrying the missile and launcher would periodically move on unpaved roads from shelter to shelter. At one of the 23 shelters, the missile and its launcher would be installed. A mass simulator with identical weight and other properties would then replace the missile and launcher in the transporter. These simulators would have been installed in each shelter at the time of construction. At each remaining shelter, installation procedures using the mass simulators would be carried out so that Soviet surveillance systems would not know which shelter actually contains the missile. Additionally, electromagnetic and other emissions would be simulated in each empty shelter and in the transporter. Normally, the MX missile would change shelters within its cluster only after a routine maintenance cycle, perhaps a few times per year. If compromise of missile location is suspected, the system could operate in two additional ways to maintain its survivability. First, all missiles could be relocated to other shelters in several hours. Such a reposturing would ensure that all missile locations remain undetected. Secondly, the transporter with its missile and launcher could be placed in constant motion. Upon tactical warning of attack, the missile and launcher would be deployed into the nearest shelter. Through a combination of concealment and mobility, the security of the MX system can be maintained. As a result, the Soviets must target all 4,600 shelters to destroy a significant number of MX missiles, which in itself should deter such an attack. Should the National Command Authorities require MX to retaliate, the shelter door would open, the launcher would emerge, erect, and eject the missile. The first stage would ignite, and MX would be on its way to its assigned target. Many tests have been conducted in the evaluation of the various basing mode concepts. This 1.4 million pound transporter vehicle is now being used for roadability and maneuverability testing. Several different types of dirt and gravel roads have been constructed for the vehicle to operate on to determine cost and durability. Scale models of horizontal shelters were constructed and subjected to high explosive blast, simulating nuclear environments to gather design data. Large sheltered doors were constructed and tested in debris studies. This data is being applied to the current design. Missile ejection from a canister has been repeatedly demonstrated in a series of design feasibility tests, and the concept of free flight ignition, or cold launch, has been demonstrated in the Polaris Poseidon Trident flight test. The MX system has been conceived to maximize salt verification. The design enables Soviet surveillance systems to determine how many missile launchers have been assembled and deployed. First, at the designated assembly area, all missile and launcher components would be received from their manufacturers. Assembly would occur in facilities with openable roofs to expedite observation for salt verification. Only one missile would be assembled at a time, with the process taking about a week. The assembled missile in its launcher would be transferred to the deployment area using a special transport vehicle on a designated transportation network. Each shelter cluster would be accessible only through a major verification barrier. The special transport vehicle would deposit the missile in its launcher at the cluster maintenance facility. After the special transport vehicle leaves, the barrier would be reinstalled, ensuring that a second missile could not be introduced into that cluster. The missile in its launcher would be loaded into the transporter in the cluster, the only place this unit will exist in operational form. This combined unit would now visit each of the 23 shelters, with the missile and launcher being installed inside one of them and its place in the transporter taken by the simulator. This entire assembly process would be repeated for each shelter cluster and would be reversed should removal of any missile be required. In placement of an MX missile and launcher for each set of shelters would complete deployment for that valley. As another verification feature, each shelter would be fitted with ports, which could be removed for inspection. This would allow Soviet surveillance systems to verify the number of deployed missiles. The transporter itself is another aid to salt verification. Just slightly smaller than this earlier version, at a loaded weight of up to 1.25 million pounds and a length of 180 feet, the transporter will be too heavy and too cumbersome to travel off-road or on other than the specially constructed roads. It would sink into the surface, be trapped by terrain variation, or tip over. Every effort will be made to minimize the environmental impact of the MX. In addition to withdrawing as little public land as possible, the shelters and road networks are being designed to be nearly flush with the ground for maximum landscape blending. It should be remembered that a typical valley with shelters and roads drawn in to actual scale would look like this photo rather than as depicted for clarity in the animation. The required environmental impact studies are underway. 2 have been completed and 2 more are in process, one for selection of a deployment area and the other for a production decision in 1983. There may also be supplemental environmental impact statements. MX will be as energy self-sufficient as possible. Each shelter may require approximately 20 kilowatts of power. To generate the power required, the use of solar or other renewable energy systems, such as geothermal plants and windmills, will be investigated to reduce the need for commercial power. The overall cost of the MX system during its 10-year acquisition period is about $33 billion in 1980 constant dollars. Its operating costs are $440 million per year in 1980 dollars. As a comparison, our Minuteman system costs $40 billion in comparable dollars, and its operation averages about $340 million in 1980 dollars. Our B-52 program costs $54 billion in 1980 dollars, and Trident will cost $39 billion. Since both are manned systems and more labor-intensive, the operating cost of these systems runs about 3 times the cost of MX. MX has been sized within the constraints of SALT II and to a level necessary to maintain the deterrent posture of our strategic triad. With SLBM forces at near parity and the U.S. bomber forces with an advantage in cruise missiles, it is important that the MX role be one of assuring a balance with the Soviet ICBM forces. The MX operational force, as currently planned, presents any adversary with the choice of unacceptable options. If the Soviets choose to attack our triad, excluding the 4,600 MX shelters, they can expect an unacceptable response from 200 MX missiles with 2,000 warheads. Or if they choose to attack the entire triad, including MX, they would expend almost all of their ICBM resources, leaving the U.S. with almost half of the MX warheads. In either case, any aggressor is deterred from an initial attack if the outcome is guaranteed to place him at a disadvantage. In addition to preserving our deterrent posture without adding more ICBMs to our inventory, MX will provide a new strategic capability to keep pace with possible Soviet force buildup by adding additional shelters instead of missiles. Moreover, the MX system provides the flexibility to deter a high Soviet warhead buildup. We could counter such a Soviet buildup by increasing our shelters in pace with their warheads, or, in the extreme case, by adding a ballistic missile defense to MX if the Soviet actions warranted withdrawal from the existing anti-ballistic missile treaty. In this regard, we plan to construct the basic 4,600 shelters in such a way that an additional 2,000 shelters could be added within the original shelter deployment area. Furthermore, the Air Force and Army are working together to ensure that MX is designed to be compatible with the Army's low-altitude ballistic missile defense system. DoD planners believe such a Soviet force expansion against our shelters would not be attractive to the Soviet Union. In fact, the Department of Defense believes that the MX will provide the foundation to ultimately reduce the number of strategic arms in future arms control agreements. By decoupling force survivability from force size, we have the flexibility to adjust the number of shelters in the face of an expanding threat without increasing the number of missiles. Conversely, we could remove some number of missiles as part of a future arms control agreement while maintaining a constant number of shelters. This is a unique and extremely desirable feature of the MX basing mode. It provides a powerful incentive to the Soviets to seek stability rather than additional firepower. In summary, MS is vitally necessary to the future security of the United States. It sustains our strategic triad and, most importantly, sets the climate for mutual nuclear arms reduction for future arms control agreements. MS ensures our ICBM survivability into the 21st century.
Will we be ready? That's the question we sought to answer in the Nevada desert. The occasion, a joint Department of Defense, Department of Energy nuclear weapons accident exercise. The doctrine for response forces at such an accident is straightforward enough in outline. You put out the fire, remove and treat casualties, establish command and control, contain the contamination, render the weapon safe, and start recovery operations. And what a tremendous effort lies behind those simple words. What a potential for serious complications. So we're talking about an event that literally explodes in the news media and in the public mind. Our government, from the White House on down, demands a quick, competent response to contain the danger first, then eliminate it, and finally recover from it. Now here is the Air Force on-scene commander at the exercise site. Roger. The exercise you are about to see was the first of its kind, unique in scope and duration, and consequently unique in its great importance to all who share responsibility in nuclear weaponry. Its purpose was to test our responses, to play out from the first mayday call to the final cleanup the complete scenario of actions required by a major nuclear action. From this exercise, we all learned valuable lessons. It showed how critically important is each individual's function and the total effort. It proved that your personal response, your decision, your recall of what you learned in training can make the difference between a widespread calamity or a swiftly contained local incident. The basic facts were these. An Air Force C-141 with 7 crew members crashed and burned in the Nevada desert. Aboard was a group of nuclear weapons being carried to a depot. 6 complete weapons and components for 2 more, from the inventories of the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. The D-Day clock best presents ticking at 09:55 hours, with a potential broken arrow message from Nellis Air Force Base. Confirmation went out within half an hour when a reconnaissance helicopter from the nearby Army camp, Fort Mercury, found the wreckage 30 miles away. The grim message was, no evidence of life, aircraft badly broken up. The first word of the nuclear weapons accident goes to the National Military Command Center, then to the topmost level, including the Secretary of Defense, the White House Situation Room, and the JNACC, the Joint Nuclear Accident Coordinating Center. Follow-on alerts in this case went to over 50 different agencies, commands, and units in the armed services, the Departments of Energy, Justice and State, and several Nevada offices. The nature of the event is such that a shock wave runs through our whole government structure, which unless contained can soon expand into a state of public alarm. First response was from the nearest military unit, which happened to be the Army. By helicopter and ground vehicle, their response team arrived at the site by noon. Craters near the wreckage showed that high explosive detonations had occurred. The question of contamination was quickly answered when the first reading showed 2,000 counts per minute on the alpha radiation detector. Every contamination suit and mask must be worn. That radiation was real, not simulated. It was radium-223 with a half-life of 11 days. It had been spread in a calculated pattern over the crash site at a level that ensured against health hazards, but at the same time gave real instrument readings. We should note at this point that this exercise included all services and the Department of Energy and was evaluated by umpires from these agencies. Army Brigadier General Carlson, as senior military officer present, assumed responsibility as the initial on-site commander. Military police set up a partial security cordon and would complete it as soon as the contamination profile could be drawn. Army control team members now properly suited up, boots and vamps, moved onto the crash site and within an hour found 3 bodies of crewmen and 2 nuclear weapons. One Army weapon pinned under the wing and 1 Air Force weapon half buried in the ground. Now, 2 civilians appeared in the area unexpectedly. They were promptly stopped by the MC, who proved to be the owners of this land and soon wanted to talk about damage claims. One of them had picked up some contamination and had to be held for his own safety until the decontamination unit was set up. Meanwhile, a steady stream of reports, notifications, and requests for additional support were going out from the Army Field Command Post. Among them was a request to the Federal Aviation Administration to create a prohibited air corridor over the crash site, 10 miles wide and 10,000 feet high. Normally, we have no authority on private property. The national defense area may be established in an accident like this where nuclear weapons are involved. Now the complexity of the operation was growing by the hour. The question arose as to whether the county coroner could handle contaminated bodies. Explosive ordnance disposal teams from the Army, Navy, Marines, and the Air Force were called for, since weapons belonging to each service were involved. The Department of Energy alerted weapons design people from the Livermore Laboratory, Sandia, and Los Alamos. At Nellis Air Force Base, the disaster response force assembled and departed for the crash site to support the Army team. By late afternoon, a Navy EOD team arrived from China Lake Naval Station in California. Shortly after, the Army's Alpha team came in from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to aid in the radiation survey and contamination control line operations. The newsmen were not far behind, asking for interviews and for a look at the wreckage. They wanted names of casualties, cause of the crash, and details on potential radiation hazards to civilians living downwind. An official statement from General Carlson's public affairs officer, cleared by higher authorities, was issued to the news media. It stated the basic facts as they were then known, and acknowledged that nuclear weapons were involved. Now it's obvious that a very large logistical effort was needed to feed, shelter, and sustain our forces here. In a real nuclear accident, the crunch would be felt in a few hours. Food, clothing, tents, water, vehicles, fuel, sanitation, expanded communication, all would be urgently needed right now. To save exercise time, a tent city had been set up previously to shelter 400 people. It's true that such a camp wouldn't exist until several days later at a real accident site, but its presence didn't affect the central objectives of the exercise. And, in fact, there would still be plenty of discomfort, sleeplessness, and cold rations to go around. A second Navy EOD team had arrived by now from Hawthorne, Nevada. The third and fourth nuclear weapons were found. First damage assessments were made and render-safe procedures were started. All 7 of the aircrew casualties were located by the search team. Telephone lines were laid to ease the problem of communication with security guards far out in the field. By the end of D-Day, a good start had been made, but only a start, on controlling the situation. The radiation survey had not yet been completed. 2 weapons and most of the separate components had not yet been found. Communications were minimal, but situation reports to higher headquarters had started. But the news was great, and among the urgent requests that flowed from the command staff were these: aerial photos of the site, an aerial radiation survey, the long-range communications package called Jackpot, the Air Force's Occupational and Environmental Health Lab, and the Army's Radiological Assistance Medical Team. The Army was still in command at the site since they responded first in the nearest military installation. But the Air Force, by regulation, would soon take over responsibility since they had possession of the weapons at the time of the accident. In fact, the 22nd Air Force Disaster Response Force was now assembling at Travis Air Force Base, California, and would soon be airborne. At about midnight of D-Day, the lead party of 23 scientists and technicians from the Department of Energy's Weapons Design Laboratories arrived. They were briefed at once by General Carlson's staff, then sent off a status report to their headquarters, and finally tried to get a few hours sleep in the desert cold. We can close out the first day of this exercise with one further comment. The three major television networks and most major newspapers carried stories on this operation right from the start. We were definitely in the public eye. The next day began with a planning meeting of unit leaders. Render-safe procedures of the weapons had first priority. Early in the day, an EOD team found more of the classified weapons components near the wreckage and reported a high radiation count near the aircraft tail. There was by now a steady influx of technical personnel. Navy Radiation Control, or RADCON teams, arrived from several locations throughout the United States. They were joined by Marine EOD and RADCON personnel from California and Arizona. By mid-morning, render-safe procedures on the two Navy weapons were completed. A large mobile crane had been requested on D-Day and has now turned onto the site to help in weapon recovery. One of the Army's weapons was turned under a wing and an engine. As soon as these were lifted off, EOD personnel were able to electrically face the weapon. The situation report that went out from the Army's Field Command Post before noon placed the count at 206 military personnel now present, plus the 30 from the Department of Energy's weapons laboratories, with more to come. Communications were in danger of being swamped. But the arrival at the airstrip of the JCS Jackpot mobile communications package from McGill Air Force Base in Florida promised some relief. Next to arrive was the EOD team from Hill Air Force Base, Utah, to perform render-safe procedures on the two Air Force weapons. Meanwhile, the ground radiation survey pressed ahead toward a complete map of the contaminated area. The point of distraction. A crowd of noisy pickets descended on the command post, protesting the presence of nuclear weapons. The television news crew came along to record the fracas, and the lawyer's spokesman demanded to see the commander and threatened a court injunction. The security forces were kept busy containing the more aggressive pickets. The county sheriff sent a deputy to help deal with these civilians, and in due time they departed. It's clear that at any nuclear weapons accident, the on-scene commander and his staff are under tremendous pressure from all sides. The urgent work of a large and diverse force of specialists has to be organized and prioritized. A flood of requests for special equipment, communications, and logistical aid has to be met. There are demands from the press. from local officials, from next of kin, and from alarmed citizens. Higher headquarters tracked the situation continuously. All this is in the context of a situation that can be physically dangerous to all present and possibly to nearby residents. More than that, public confidence in us turns on how we conduct ourselves under stress. To put it bluntly, we're expected to know what we're doing, and we better show that we do. Early in the afternoon of the second day, the specialists from the DOE's weapons laboratories processed across the contamination control line and joined in the work. They were a welcome addition. First, for their expertise in weapons design, and secondly, because of their sophisticated radiation detection instruments. By mid-afternoon, shipping documents had been found in the wreckage, giving important confirmation of weapons specifics. A Department of Energy contractor now made the first aerial survey. Photos were taken from which a more accurate plotting could be made of weapons locations and debris. During the afternoon, field operations were momentarily suspended so that mortuary affairs personnel could remove casualties to a decontamination area. Now the Air Force's Disaster Response Force arrived to take over from the Army. The new on-scene commander was to be Brigadier General James Gardner from MAX 22nd Air Force. After he and his team had been briefed, the change of command was sealed with a friendly handshake, and all forces were placed at General Gardner's disposal. At Nellis, the air transportable Radiac package called A-Trap arrived from Kelly Air Force Base, Texas. Its capacity for instrument calibration and repair was urgently needed. The last of the weapons was now located. It had suffered a low-order detonation on impact. Parts of this and other weapons were also found during the afternoon, all of them contaminated, but many of the components were still missing. By late afternoon, the teams processed out for the day, hot, tired, and sweaty. A nighttime staff meeting was inaugurated to brief everyone on the day's results, the problems that had surfaced, and the plans for tomorrow. While that meeting was going on, another was held, bringing together the scientists and specialists from the weapons labs on the one hand, and the EOD and LabCon personnel from the services on the other. Most of them had never met before and knew little of one another's capabilities. A great deal of helpful information was exchanged, and some initial confusion about differing procedures was laid to rest. The second day closed with considerable work having been accomplished, but a lot remaining to be done. 3 weapons had been found, 2 weapons had been traced, 1 was still buried, and many components still missing. A question remained as to the full extent of the area's contamination. We now had over 250 people on site. We had added a complete radiation analysis lab, a mobile decontamination facility, and the Lawrence Livermore Lab, ARAC, atmospheric release advisory capability. This could be used to predict any possible downwind contamination hazards. The Air Force's Occupational and Environmental Health Lab was here from Brooks Air Force Base also. The aerial photos were being developed, and an aerial radiation survey was on for tomorrow. So ended the second day. At Nellis, more expert help arrived from the East Coast. This is the Army's Radiological Assistance Medical Team from Walter Reed Hospital. They've helped to find health hazards and analyze air and water samples around the crash site. As the hotline opened on the third day, Department of Energy specialists were joining the Air Force, Navy,
and Army EOD teams to continue the weapons recovery work. Meanwhile, the on-scene commander's staff is in touch with many agencies in the outside world. The local sheriff, the OSI, the State Attorney General, and the Air Force Inspection and Safety Center. Now began the first radiation survey from the air by a Department of Energy contractor. Within an hour, they reported finding a new hotspot southeast of the crash site at a previously unsuspected location. The ground team was sent out to define its size and boundaries, and security was expanded to include it. Soil samples were taken outside the cordon and down the public road to the south. The analysis showed nothing above normal background radiation. Shortly after noon, two civilians in a dune buggy decided to try to cross the security line and pick up a few souvenirs. They didn't get very far. After they identified themselves and were checked for contamination, they were allowed to go on their way. The demands of the news media were a constant pressure on the commander and his public affairs officers. News releases were given out periodically, but the reporters always had further questions. There were queries on the possible threat to public health, property damage, the whole matter of transporting nuclear weapons safely, the specific cause of this accident, and many more. Meanwhile, the recovery work went on. A joint Navy DOE team found a heavy component of an exploded weapon in its crater, contaminated. The mobile crane was called in once more to stabilize the Air Force weapon so that the sand could be dug away. Then the render safe procedure on it was finally accomplished. As to the Army weapon, it presented some delicate problems that would be talked over far into the night. Late in the afternoon, the mother of one of the dead crew members came to the site. She wanted to claim his body for burial. She wanted to know how it happened and why, whose fault it was, and what her son had died for. It all comes down on the commander and his staff, the big crises and the small ones, the individual sorrows, the public fears. By the end of the third day, we had a pretty good radiation survey in hand. The perimeters were now defined and security was set. A request had gone out for more respirators, an airlift of 7 feet, and more heavy equipment. At the evening's license, the list of work to be done seemed almost as long as ever, but the list of accomplishments was now quite respectable. Early on the fourth day, a team of Army and DOE weapons lab people took radiographs of the damaged Army weapon. It could not be safely moved until its internal components had been stabilized. In mid-morning, the Cactus Alliance was first up. This was a group of environmentalists who wanted everything stopped and had a state court order to enforce it. The on-site judge advocate stepped in. He advised the commander that the issuance of the restraining order was outside the state court's power. This judgment was later sustained by the State Attorney General. The staff judge advocate relayed the decision by telephone to local civil authorities, and operations continued. The Air Force's Contamination Disposal Team now arrived from Kelly Air Force Base, Texas. Their work could not begin until all weapons had been recovered. But it was not too early to start planning. Now, a second aerial survey of radiation was made, and an unexpected hotspot was discovered in the north part of the site. A team of Department of Energy specialists deployed there found high radiation counts and updated the plot of the area accordingly. So far, there hadn't been any wind, but we knew the dead calm conditions
seldom lasted long out here. When a little breeze came up, the Army RADCOM team was tasked to get background air samples. Meanwhile, Marine EOD people were keeping up the search for missing weapons parts. Other teams found most of the classified parts of the Air Force weapon and a major classified component of the Army weapon. These critical parts were brought to a special holding area and covered. With over 400 people now at the site, there seemed no end to logistical needs. Requests went out for such items as generator fuel, rubber mats, salt, brushes, and surgical gloves. As the wind gusted up and blew sand around the mess tent, the cooks broke out cold rations for dinner. Toward the end of the fourth day, the contamination problem was complete enough to permit the contamination control line to be moved closer to the crash site. The major problem remaining was the damaged Army weapon, but that fix would take some doing. A charter flight was set up to bring in the 2 tanks of nitrogen gas, special regulator, and accessories to provide the container environment needed for shipping the weapon. Not all of the exploded or buried components of other weapons had been found, but persistence hopefully would pay off. Newsmen's questions were now turning more toward possible long-term danger. How much did we know about plant and soil contamination? How far would the wind carry? What about evacuation of residents downwind? Why didn't we warn the public? Such stories made newspaper copies, and any commander in this situation must be careful in his answers. But he must answer, and as candidly as possible. Early on day 5, a team set out to take soil samples outside the security perimeter to see what effect the wind had on radiation dispersal. Water samples from wells in nearby towns were also taken, and all results were negative. The Air Force weapon was examined again and found to be okay to remove. More contaminated pieces were found in and around the cratered areas, and the Marines found more fragments of their weapons components. In mid-morning, the mayor of a nearby town demanded to know how much longer the cleanup was going to take. Local business was suffering. He was briefed by the commander, and the judge advocate advised him on claims procedures. The weapons lab team, shortly after noon, made a successful fix of the troublesome Army weapon, using the foam cure and nitrogen gas. Then the crane moved it to a holding area. The sheriff arrived in the mid-afternoon with a new surprise, a bench warrant for the arrest of General Gardner. The charge was contempt of court for ignoring the previous restraining order. It was a hectic day for the legal officer. After consultation, he advised the sheriff that the general would not submit to the arrest warrant on the grounds that there could be no contempt of the previous order, since the court had no authority to issue it. The sheriff did not press the issue. A representative from the Office of the Secretary of Defense now arrived to get a first-hand look at how we were handling the situation. He received a very thorough briefing on every aspect of the operation. He expressed general approval and asked for an outline of the cleanup plan before leaving. The wind picked up to 30 knots late in the afternoon, hampering operations. Foul tenting, blowing sand, and cold added to the general discomfort. The cook did manage a hot ration dinner for all that evening. After that, there was the staff meeting to review the day's activities, and most especially to plan the work of identifying weapons components, decontaminating, and packaging. As the fifth day ended, personnel from the DOE's Context Assembly Facility
were established in a separate tent to coordinate this final stage of the weapons recovery effort. By the sixth day, operations were going much more smoothly throughout the camp. One big item was the completion of the telephone system linking all units at the site. The arrival of the 1,500-gallon water tankers was a big help. They were used to wash down contaminated vehicles, as well as dampen the dirt roads and parking areas for dust control. And best of all, the wind subsided. The new people were still on site receiving briefings and asking questions on our progress. One man reported that a congressional investigation had been demanded in Washington. The answer to that was that any accident involving nuclear weapons would naturally be investigated in every detail. The search for weapons components was narrowing down to the two pieces still missing: fragments of an Army weapon and some Marine weapons parts. In mid-morning, a television news camera helicopter overflew the crash site. The on-scene commander at once ordered the legal officer to ask for an intercept of the chopper on landing. Now the Texas Alliance was heard from again. Still another restraining order was delivered, this time from the federal court of this district. The calls to the United States Attorney and the Judge Advocate General cleared this obstacle as well. To put to rest any lingering fears about radiation, the commander sent letters to the mayors of all nearby towns that there was not and would not be any danger to the public health from this operation. By early evening of the sixth day, the recovery plan was completed. The identification of weapons components and packaging for shipment was proceeding well. The last remaining weapons recovery task was to find the still missing pieces. In the morning of the seventh day, a joint team led by personnel from the Los Alamos Scientific Lab made a sweep of the area north of the wreckage with radiation detection meters and found 4 of 6 missing parts. The other 2 were found, and all EOD teams could finally say, mission accomplished. And so this first-of-a-kind exercise of our national response capability came to an end. The events that took place were staged and accelerated to compress what would take weeks or even months to do into a brief 7-day period. After all the critiques were in, we saw that there is a continuing need for us to review and improve our response capabilities for nuclear weapons accidents.